Alright, so I don't have time to make a full new video, so welcome to another episode of the Squawks Cast, where I just rant, and I guess it kind of is like a podcast. I don't know. So the main thing I wanted to make a video on that it's not really worth making a video because Ruin will come out and everyone wants to see a Ruin theory, and Ruin may or may not debunk or confirm the theory, so it would be kind of a moot point if I made it after Ruin came out, and I don't think I could finish one in time, so I'll just have to edit together my best takes and concepts in this and pass it off as a podcast. So the main thing I want to talk about is how I think Ruin will affect the nature of how we handle the books, and how I'm worried it won't do that at all. So what I mean is, something I talked about in the MatPat Robot Kid Intervention video is, I'm not sure how you debunk or bunk Robot Kid. Well, the conclusion I had was that it's very easy to prove Robot Kid is right if that's the intent. You just show that Gregory's a robot with schematics, or you have it like, Gregory, you're a robot? But the inverse is much harder to prove. For example, you could reveal that Casey is his sister, but then people would just say, oh, they're twin robots, and look for the slightest imperfection in how Casey acts. Actually, it's Cassie, whoops. And then maybe even try to connect it to Sammy from the books, and have, like, Sammy and Charlie, Cassie and Gregory, etc. And I feel like Tales Games has a very similar thing going on, where it's like, how do you bunk or debunk that? Because I'm of the opinion that a lot of the things from Tales probably will make their way into the game version, especially the concept of the Mimic. But then again, you have stuff like the entire Stitchline plotline never being referenced in the games other than, like, the plush trap chaser cabinet, and I think there's a fetch cabinet? And that makes me wonder, like, let's say Tales isn't canon. How does Steel prove it isn't canon, assuming that they're still going to have to follow a lot of the same similar plot beats? Let's say Steel and Scholastic were both given outlines of what the security breach era of the story will be like, and what concepts have to appear in adaptations and interpretations of that. And let's say the Mimic appears. Well, without having to directly change or address something from the books, how do you say it isn't the same Mimic from Tales games? And that's, once again, under the assumption that they aren't connected, for the sake of this argument. I'm not saying they are or aren't, I'm saying, if they aren't, how do you prove they aren't? I would say the easiest way to debunk that the books are in the gameverse, but I'm not even sure Steel will take this route, is to confirm that the corpse around Burntrap is William. If they did that, that A, kind of throws a wrench in Fright's being canon because William should be exploded, and B, confirms it's not the same corpse that we see in the epilogues. Now, granted, Tales itself could also debunk itself if at the end of the Tales books the Mimic is destroyed. Sort of like how I felt like there was this energy of like, oh, maybe the Stitch Wraith... I felt like there was a sort of energy like, oh, maybe the Stitch Wraith will appear in Security Breach before Security Breach came out, when we were still getting the Stitch Wraith thingers. Granted, that was when Tales games and Fright's games were very different and very early, but point being, there was that idea for a while, and then the Stitch Wraith ends up being freed and destroyed at the end of the story. And I'm wondering if the Mimic will happen the same way. As for actual predictions for Ruin, because I feel like everyone wants to do their predictions, I have a feeling we're going to sort of reenact a new interpretation of Princess Quest. I don't think it'll just be Princess Quest in 3D. I feel like what we're going to kind of cover is that we're going to be doing a lot of the plot line, like a lot of the elements that the Mimic / Glitch Trap uses to ensnare people. The thing, like, my wild out there hope is that we'll see an older Gregory because time has passed. If time has passed at all, we don't know how long down the road this is. My current go-to ending is just the aft ending, because I feel like that was the most important one. It leaves the Pizzaplex in the ambiguous state you could adapt for Ruin, because, like, you can't have the fire escape ending, for example, because the entire place is destroyed. There's nothing left in that ending. And you can't have, well, like, the other, like, the van drive-away ending. You can't have that, because the Pizzaplex is still standing and Monty's just the main animatronic. Same thing with the Vanny Freed ending, is like, well, that one leaves it in an ambiguous state where we don't really know what happens to Freddy's, but it isn't destroyed in any way. The only ending where things are destroyed but in a questionable unknown state is the after ending, which is also the one in full 3D. It's the one that doesn't have stars. It's the one that's implied to be the true ending a few times via the soundtrack, as well as the fact that in the Switch port, the ending's labeled a true ending Burntrap, which all seems to imply that's the direction we're going, but I could see a universe where Vanny Redeemed is the other ending. Or they could pull, like, a massive, like, switcheroo on us and give us kind of a they're all sort of canon route, where Gregory has done elements of all of the endings, where it's like, oh, he freed Vanny, and he then went to fight Burn Trap, and that crashes down the Pizzaplex, but Vanny's still redeemed, and that's why her mask is on the floor. Like, they could do something really weird like that, or they could just keep it ambiguous what endings continue off from. My main guess for Cassie is that she's either going to be our new villain moving forward once she's controlled by Glitchtrap by the end, or she's going to be the one to take down Glitchtrap to set up a new story arc, or like, I have a feeling that this isn't the end of the Security Breach arc, because we have Help Wanted coming up, and I don't know why you would name a game Help Wanted 2 if it wasn't continuing the Help Wanted plotline. Like, because Help Wanted was setting up the new arc, and it would be weird if Help Wanted 2 is setting up another new arc, while still being titled and in the series of the prior arc. So I feel like no matter what, we're still going to be in the Steel Wool storyline, you know? Something I did want to talk about, going back to the book topic, I'm really worried if Tales games gets confirmed, because based on what we have in the Tales book so far, it's going to become really weird moving forward if they are confirmed. So something I've mentioned a couple times in Discord, and I think even on streams, I'm not sure I've ever said in a video really, is the Hippo Magnet. It's not end all be all. I wouldn't use that as definitive proof that Tales isn't in the game's verse. But I will bring it up when talking about, like, hey, it's complicated. It's not as simple as you think. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, Tales has the Bobby Dots, which in the Bobby Dots, I totally forgot his name. The main character, Bobby Dots, finds a Hippo Magnet and uses to hack systems, but it's said specifically in the Bobby Dots that Hippo Magnet was decommissioned and thrown out because it was causing system damage in the store, and they're discontinued. So you're not supposed to be able to get the Hippo Magnet. He finds it in the trash of the Pizzaplex. And that's directly opposed to how we see it in Security Breach, where it's an entry gift. It's like you get in here and you get a complimentary gift, which is like, people have said, oh, maybe they're just trying to get rid of it, whatever, but it's like, that should do the opposite. The reason it's taken out is because it's causing system damage. Why would you give that away for free as a part of your entry into this place? But anyway, that's not the end all be all, because that's just a mistake or a continuity difference if they're in different universes. What I guarantee happened there, whether it's in the game verse or not, is that Scott said, hey, there needs to be a Mr. Hippo Magnet that shorts machines out and causes damage. And the writer of the book said, oh, these must be taken out because, they cause system damage, to explain why he would find it in the trash in the story. And Steelwool said, oh, Gregory will get it as a complimentary entry gift. That's what happened there. Whether you think that means it's two separate continuities or not is up to you. It doesn't really matter. I don't think that's the end all be all. But if they are in the same continuity, that shows the writers are subject to just making blatant mistakes that we can't rely on, even if they are canon. And once again, I'm using canon to mean in the game continuity because, it's just simpler. Having to say it's in the game continuity every time is really annoying. And that's a small mistake in a normal series. But in FNAF, it only takes a few of those to add up and really mess things up. Like, think about it. What if they made a mistake where they said a character was robotic and what Scott wanted them to say was, they had an awkward pause as they were in thought. And now MatPat has full free range, or whoever has full free range. It's not just a MatPat thing. I should say the community in general. It's full range to say that character's a robot because Silver Eyes, another book series, did that. And the more you give the book's credence to be in the game continuity, the more people will try to draw on other things to say, everything is important, everything's relevant. And maybe they are, but if the writers can make even small mistakes, those will add up and make the story really frustrating to dissect. And the Hippo Magnet is just the simplest example of that. For example, a theory you could easily make with Hippo Magnet is that what we're seeing in the Tales books is actually a sequel to Ruin. And the whole talk of the buried Pizzaplex and Pizza Place in the epilogues is them rebuilding the Pizzaplex or something like that. And that at this point they've been decommissioned, like the Mr. Hippo Magnet's been decommissioned. You could make theories and claims like that just based on that Hippo Magnet. You can point out the difference, but you could argue it's intentional. Like, they're trying to tell something about the Hippo Magnet, and it will become really frustrating and confusing. And the other thing is, who knows how many of those differences happen? That was supposed to be the story that, Scott supposedly went in and corrected because there were mistakes or whatever, to make it more like the game's Pizzaplex. At least that's the story I've heard. And if that difference is still in there in the updated draft, I'm really worried about what that would mean for the books moving forward and the games. I guess I do want to talk. I wanted to make a video about the novel trilogy's inconsistencies, and maybe I still will. So maybe I'll just do like a quick flyby version of that theory if I get around to it, which is, are a lot of the things established in the books things that have to happen because that's the plot of FNAF, and that these are true in most continuities? Or are these things that have to happen because, oh, this thing from the games doesn't happen, so something like it has to fill in that place? The main example is Circus Baby's Pizza World doesn't really exist in the novel continuity, at least not the same way in the games. The Fun Times kind of do, but not really the Circus Baby's Pizza World plot line. And we know that's like established lore. And that's just a blatant, completely different thing that's handled in the books. It's the final Charlie bot killing Elizabeth and that's a complete, like, she's not meant to perform on stage. She's meant to be the final Charlie bot. So, like, while there are some similarities in how it happens, it's like, did Scott just say, oh, Kira, make sure that there's a feminine robot that's humanoid that kills Elizabeth, and then Kira thought of that, and then Scott was like, yep, that's good, that's fine, we can work with that? Or, like, other nonsense, you argue it's a retcon, and I don't think it is. I think that's just, in that continuity, that's how they decided to handle it. Another difference is, like, Mike and the bite victim don't exist at all in the novel's continuity. Do you count that as they're not important? Or what I'm personally thinking, something I want to talk about in that video, is something that's interesting to me is how every major series we've had so far, except for Tales, that adapts to the sort of Scott era of storytelling, the click team like storyline, has had a human character who survives some soul / like death altering event that kind of manifests them to like communicate with and work with the spiritual characters of the series that are working against Afton. Like Colton, Mike, and Larson all have that sort of plot beat, but they're very different characters in functionality. But they all complete the same plot checklist, you know? Like, they all do the things that have to happen to be the FNAF storyline. And that's something I'm thinking about. I'm like, does Scott have like a list of what has to happen in each continuity? And that's what he meant by there will be inevitable similarities between the games and books. Because that would explain why that plot beat keeps getting repeated. Because it's like, yeah, I know there's an argument of parallels don't mean it's a different continuity. It just means, oh, it's like when two people are similar, it's history repeating itself, yada yada. I've heard that whole argument. But it's weird that they do a lot of the same core things that need to happen. Another one is like, the puppet doesn't exist in the novel trilogy really at all. But Charlie still has to die to William, which once again implies to me that these are like things that have to happen. But because there is no bite victim in continuity, Charlie has to die and be important in some way beyond just leading to the Charlie bots. And Fredbear's has to close, so I guarantee Scott saw that, or Kira saw that, with like Scott's outline of what has to happen and Scott's notes of like, hey, make sure this happens in the story, I'll double check this and look at the book and all that and write certain sections. And saw that, oh shit, there has to be a reason that Fredbear's closes. But the kid who makes sure it closed, the kid who's the reason it's closed, doesn't exist in this universe. We haven't written, so we have to write that story in and have to make that character important because that's kind of how these novels work. Or we could just say Charlie died there. Is that a change made there? Or does Charlie just die at Fredbear's? Is that a continuity difference, like how Elizabeth and the final Charlie bot are handled for Baby? Or is that Scott's note that, oh, Charlie dies at Fredbear's? Or was Charlie changed to die at Fredbear's so this could happen? William stuff has the same thing going on, where it's like, did Scott actually have the note that William stuffed the kids? Or is there no puppet to stuff them, so William has to stuff them? That's a mess with the novels right now. It's like, how do you handle the novels? Because, like, who knows what's an intentional difference and what's not? And also, going back to the Tales games being canon. It's like, okay, let's say Tales games canon and Frights games canon. You have all the stories that we have no clue whether they're tied to the Stitchline plotline or not. The stories do this constantly at Frights, where they'll have like a random B plot that's mentioned, and then it's unclear whether that's lore relevant or not. Is that something the writer said to fill it out to give us time with the characters before the dramatic horror stuff happens? Or is that like a metaphor or foreshadowing? And some stories do this better than others, in my opinion. I think Step Closer does this better because you have the whole Final Destination gimmick with that story. So you can have those slice-of-lifey moments and then build up the horror scenes in those moments. But then you have stories like Into the Pit, where there's the whole like, oh, sometimes things aren't 100% retellings. And then it's like, is that trying to say that the ball pit isn't a perfect recreation of the MCI? Or is that just a throwaway line? Is it not? Who knows? And you can see where this all becomes messy and frustrating, where it's like, the second Frights is taken into the game's continuity as a consideration, there are so many things the writers do and so many random changes and ideas they suggest. And then there's something I've never even seen anyone really talk about, which is, what is the possibility that a writer thinks they're writing the canon? Because, I mean, like, let's say a writer just writes stories and they're given a pretty detailed list of like, oh, these are elements I want to be in the stories from Scott. And then they either get an early build security breach or learn about it or whatever, and start trying to write them like they're in the same continuity, but Scott didn't intend that. What if something like that happens? That's just me spitballing and just like, who knows? But there are so many weird intricacies with writers in this that I'm just like wondering. And then once again, like I said at the start of the video, how do you confirm or deconfirm the entire subject? Like, because my highest bet right now of what would happen in Ruin, that I don't think it's going to address the books at all. But I don't think it will deconfirm the books at all. That is my initial gut feeling based on Security Breach, because that's how Security Breach worked. That is how Steele presented everything there. It's also frustrating that we don't have the final few Tales books to confirm or deconfirm things. I have no clue if that's intentional or not, because we just don't have B7 and whatever the final thing is, if B7 is or isn't the final. Because it was originally supposed to be like 9 books, but I don't think we've gotten a book 9 title. And who knows how intentional this release order is, because I guarantee Tales was written to come out right after Security Breach. I don't know if it was ever intended to be a month after, but I wonder if that just happened because Security Breach was delayed and they didn't want the books to come out before Security Breach, even though I feel like they should have. But that's just me. I'm not Steelwool, I'm not Scott, I'm not Scholastic. The other weird thing in all of this, my other thought is, and then there's an idea I've thought of, is that Scott just gives a pretty descriptive outline of things that have to happen in a FNAF universe. And I've kind of talked about this a little bit with the novels, and this is what I'm getting at with all continuities now. Scott has a specific list of, like, these things have to happen. It doesn't matter how you do them. And I think that list includes things like the MCI, that there has to be a sort of extra guardian spirit or something like that, or some special set of figures that are unique. And you have to have some human who has some connection to the ghost in an unnatural way. And you have to have William Afton. But how you handle that doesn't have to be the same in every continuity. Jake could be the equivalent of the bite victim and or Charlie for the sake of that plot line, to convey the plot of what Scott wants to be in a FNAF story. You could have Jake fill both those roles and cut out having to develop both those backstories. You only need to write one backstory if a character does 2 purposes. And I have a feeling that's why he's not called the bite victim, or he's not called something Afton, and he's not called Charlie. Because he's not supposed to literally be those characters, he's meant to fill in the roles in their plotline. He is not a parallel to either one specifically. He is... this happened with, like, the Percy Jackson movie. Look, there's a girl from Ares who's slightly meaner and tougher, and she's in the first book, but they gave all of her scenes from the first book to the character Annabeth in the movies. And this happens all around in, like, adaptations in general, where it takes too much time to develop 2 separate characters when they could have one character do it all. And I feel like characters like Andrew and Jake and all those characters who have different names but fill a lot of similar roles are like that. Because that's the biggest thing to me is, like, why do we have characters like Jake who do the exact same shit that Charlie could have done? Like, if the whole point is that these are in the same continuity as the games to give answers and tell stories that we couldn't have seen otherwise, why bother wasting time creating new characters like these that can do things that the prior characters could have done? That is the biggest thing to me where I'm like, and that's the problem with they're just parallels for, like, history repeating itself. That's not at that point. That is a character we're wasting time developing, doing the same shit a prior character could have. And you could argue, oh, Scott has a different plan for that character, and that's why they're not that character. But at the same time, it's like, some characters that doesn't work. You could argue Scott's plan for Cassidy isn't what Andrew is, and that from the second UCN was created, It was always Andrew. Let's say you're following that argument. Let's say that was always Scott's plan, even if he didn't figure it out until Frights happened. Why have Jake basically be what Charlie is? Why have Larson be what Mike could have been? If we're going to revive characters who should have died in the Fazbear Frights Fire, or not Fazbear Frights, the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place Fire. If we're going to revive those characters just to do this plot line, why not just have the original characters? We don't need to develop Larson if we know if he was Mike. We don't need to develop Jake if she was Charlie. But there are characters who clearly have roles prior characters did. It's the same thing that's like, why not just say Henry made them if the Tails is in the game's continuity? Why does Edwin need to be a new character when we could have just, like, saved some time and say, like, oh, that could have been cool. Like, just say, like, oh, this is Henry. Look at him do his things. We didn't know he had worked on the Mimic, but now we did. Or it could be a retelling of Charlie's death from his perspective. Like, the idea that Tails and Frights are in the game's continuity implies such a waste of potential and acknowledgement of things that Steelwall and Scott are just like, nah, actively ignore opportunities to tell stories about characters we know or are interested in. And that's something I've said before, but it's never been broken. There's never been a point where I feel like that isn't a running problem. And like I said, if Scott is just giving these descriptive outlines of what has to happen, and these writers are like, okay, can we make this compromise for our continuity? Scott probably will allow it. I mean, we know that happens in the novel trilogy, and we know that same characters can appear in different continuities. Like I said, I Stand By Henry is one of the most starkly different in most ways. He's recognizably Henry enough. He's about as close as, I don't know, Tom Holland Peter Parker is to a 616 Peter Parker, where there are certain defining traits of this character that have to appear to be the same character. But there are so many other differences with how they're handled and how they're written, and, like, you could easily argue, oh, book Henry would never do that, or game Henry would never do that in both instances. So it's like, not even stuff like, oh, Greg being a GGY really matters at this point, because it's like, yeah, he could be the Gregory of that universe, and he could do a lot of stuff that Gregory does, because that's what Gregory has to do. That's the plot of his character. And that still is useful information. It still shows what's happening. And honestly, that might be what Scott originally meant by all of this. Tails and Frights could be a very close adaptation in their own universe. And we can look at what kind of roles these characters have to see what they do. And we can look at what's the same and what, like, crosses over to say, oh, that helps us there. Alright, so it's been a few hours since I started editing this, and I just wrapped up editing all the audio and setting up the visuals that I have. But I do have one final idea I thought of how Frights and Tails could work, because I feel like there's a lot of unexpected gray areas you could go with. I feel like a lot of the community is treating it as it's in the game continuity or it's parallels, and that's it. And then you have a minority of people who are like, it's not related at all, or it's everything is this, it has to be super important. I feel like those are minorities in the other extremes, but it's primarily the parallels or not parallels. But I've thought of a sort of frustrating full gray area that they could be in. A sort of Tales games version, but I started thinking of it when I was thinking about what I said about the Hippo Magnet earlier in the video. Clearly Scott gave some direction or outline that the Hippo Magnet would disrupt technology and that it was cruddy or something like that. And clearly the writers of the Tales games interpreted that as it's a discarded thing to be thrown in the trash. And clearly Steelwool interpreted it as, oh, it's this cruddy intra-gif they don't really care about and is poorly made, which ends up damaging technology. Or something like that happened. Like, it could be the other way. It could go different directions. Like, Steelwool could have had that as a mission. And then Scott knew about that and told Scholastic, and then he wasn't very specific, so they just made that story based on, oh, there's this crappy Mr. Hippo Magnet. But if any degree of that is true, even if Tails was intended to be in the canon, that would make Tails an unreliable narrator almost all the way through. And I don't mean like in the meta sense where the writers are trying to write like, oh, the perspective characters don't really know what's going on, which, I mean, sometimes they are, but what I mean is, it implies that the writers might not know much about what they're writing and are having to fill in a lot of the gaps, which is what gets a lot of their weird nonsense. I remember this one quote, I think it was from the FNAF show Daco did, where he's interviewing some of the voice actors and voice actress from FNAF. And Baby's VA, I think it's Heather Masters, said she was kind of shocked when she realized Baby was a villain because she just recorded the lines. And it makes me wonder how much of that kind of instance can happen in FNAF. Going back to what I said earlier, I initially said it as more of a conspiracy theory, but it did cross my mind. If you're just given a list of plot lines for FNAF, why would you not think you're writing the official FNAF storyline? And there's other reasons that we could think outside people could be prone to failing to understand what's going on, because it's like, this kind of happened with Security Breach's translations, where it seems like patient 46 is Gregory, but 46 is referred to with female pronouns in most translations for the game. But that makes sense if you think about, oh, these translations happened in a vacuum. They were given the scripts for the things, and probably assumed that the person that the therapists were talking to was the same all the way through, given that 46 never talks and is never given a name to clarify otherwise. If they're only looking at the scripts, they would only ever see the therapist talking to someone else and assume, oh, this must be Vanessa, and they're just not talking. Because sometimes Vanessa just blanks out in dialogue. So for their localizations and translations, they might just assume it's still Vanessa and keep the she. What I'm getting at is, especially in the Security Breach era, there's some precedent for just mistakes being made if the writers are writing a ton of content, and tons of that content is subject to those kinds of small mistakes and just not having the full picture. It really blurs the lines between the books being canon and not canon. They may be written as this prequel to Security Breach, but how many of those details in said prequel could be flubbed or messed up that Scott's only minorly correcting? Because I stand by, if Scott is personally looking through these books to make sure they're 100% correct, then that is a noticeable blunder for the Hippo Magnet. It's a small thing, but it's a definitive difference between the two things. To put that all in other words, the Tales books may be written with the intent of being canon, but might just not be well made and therefore get things wrong. Which means even if these events are happening, we might just not have the level of certainty of how truthful and accurate they are. Which is probably the worst case scenario, because it means we have to take all these crazy ideas that sometimes appear with these writers, and we have to decipher what is Scott's main focus and intent, and what is he trying to get across in this weird game of telephone. And maybe it isn't. I don't fucking know. Ruin will be the be-all, end-all, hopefully, in the perfect world where Ruin addresses these questions. I just really hope we get some answers from Ruin. I don't need a perfect Bible of everything that happens in Fredbear's Family Diner all the way to the burning of the pizza plate. But I just need some answers to what are frustrating right now. If they can answer the Tales game's problems, that's fucking awesome. If they can handle that there are or aren't in the same continuity, that would be awesome. If they can handle Greg Bot, fucking best timeline. I don't care if I'm proven right or wrong about Gregory not being a robot. I just want an answer. I want to theorize about stuff like, oh, who's this character? Who's that? What are they going to do next? What do we think is going to happen in the next game? I don't want to be left wondering, can I even read these books or not? Or what are they? Are they not important? Are they important? Who fucking knows?